Estoy muy contento de estar aquí esta mañana. Muchas gracias a mi compañero José Ramón. Pero discúlpeme, tengo que continuar en inglés. The things I have to say here, these are not well-reasoned arguments. These are just some thoughts I have had in relation to the work that the project has been doing in the Wadi C2. And in a sense, it's the same idea that José Ramón just talked about, but instead of talking specifically about the Wadi, I wanted to talk more generally about some thoughts. This is all they are, some remarks about the idea that the Wadi is not a secret place, but in fact, over a long period of time, we can see perhaps that it's part of a broader pattern of activity. So again, to go back to the paradigm that José Ramón was talking about with the discovery of the cache. This was the beginning of the idea that this is a secret place, and therefore that the Wadi is in the background, somewhere hidden in the monumental landscape of Thebes. But I want to look at that in a slightly different context, which is the context in which Thebes was rediscovered in early modern times, when we see, of course, that the whole area is abandoned and empty, and the way in which perhaps an idea developed amongst the archaeologists, which has given us a false impression of the Wadi and where the Wadi stands in relation to the broader landscape, the monumental landscape of Thebes. And this place is important, the area of Medina Habu, this painting by Roberts from the 19th century. Again, this is the view of, or the plan of the Theban area in the Description de l'Egypte, in the Napoleon expedition. And what we see, of course, is a completely barren landscape, Luxor, referring to the idea perhaps just of these remains which are standing in a desert environment. But there are certain key features which stand out, and these turn out, I think, to be important in terms of understanding the broader landscape. If we go back just to the end of the 19th century, this is from the description of the Great Temple of Ramesses III at Medina Habu. From the introduction to the survey publication, that Medina Habu, when Europeans first arrived, was merely a waste of ruins, barrenness, hopelessness, and decay. So this isn't the Wadi that's being talked about. This is the West Bank generally, the picture which is created. And then there's an idea which is added to this. You see Hirscher's description of Medina Habu continues in this way. The chief reason why the vast mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medina Habu is the best preserved empire temple in Egypt is the fact that Ramses was the last of the emperors. There were no emperors who came after him to quarry away his buildings. The idea being, of course, that this is the end of things, that things finished at this moment, and then we are left with the landscape that's given to us at the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom. So this is part of what I wish to talk about now. And we can begin by putting that perhaps in a perspective of time. If we look at the early images of European travellers in the 19th century in, say, Medina Habu, in the Temple of Ramesses III, one of the things which is well known is that there was a Christian church, a well-documented Christian church inside the temple. Now, this was long abandoned at this point in the 19th century, and we'll come back to that matter. But again, it speaks to the fact that the occupation of this area did not finish with Ramesses III, did not end at the end of the New Kingdom. This is, of course, a well-known fact, but it's one we need to bear in mind. Of course, all of the archaeology of the Christian church has been removed. It was removed in the so-called the Grand Déblaiement in 1890 by D'Arcy. But it survives in photographs and so on. It's quite apparent. And, of course, some of the archaeological remains from Medina Habu point in the same direction. The processional cross, I think, is very important in the context of what we're going to talk about now as well. The idea that there are festival processions in the West Bank, not just in the Egyptian New Kingdom, but afterwards, right down into Christian times. So this is the broader timescale in which I want to look at things. And of course, when the archaeologists arrived from Chicago in the 1920s to look at Medina Habu, in the grounds of the Temple of Ramesses III, they found the village of Jami, the archaeological remains of the village of Jami, which is an important Coptic Christian village, and we have so much written information about this village that we can identify individual homes. So this is the home of a lady, a very wealthy lady called Kolodje, who was a moneylender. We know she was a moneylender because we have the receipts from her house with the records of interest that she is charging on the loans of gold, which she is making to people. So this is a very wealthy community, a literate community. It is, in many ways, exactly like the community that we see at Medina Habu at the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the community of Butakhaumun, whose prayer Jose Ramon showed you before. But of course, we are more than 1,500 years later. But the profile of the people who live at Medina Habu at this time is very comparable to the profile of the people who lived there at the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom. And this is something we see more broadly, not just at Medina Habu, but across the West Bank, right down to Coptic times. The exceptional literacy of these people, which mirrors the famous exceptional literacy of people in the village of Deir al-Medina in the Egyptian New Kingdom. This is a letter by it's a letter by by a monk called Frankie, who lived in a tomb in Sheikh Abdul Qunna, which was a very desirable address to have in the 7th century. But not so desirable as Medina Habu. We know, and we'll come back to this, that the best address, the fanciest address to have on the West Bank was in Medina Habu, which was known as the Castle of Jami, Castron and Jami, and we'll see that name again going forward. So to put this all on a kind of timeline, I just want to give us a broad timeline for Thebes as I understand it. We certainly have historical references to the West Bank at Thebes, going right back to the famous inscriptions of the governor Ankh-Tifi in the first intermediate period. So that takes us back to before the Middle Kingdom, somewhere just before 2000 BC. And then to think back to Hosha's quote there about the hopelessness and the barrenness of the West Bank, what we can say is that the community here in Luxor did not finish with the death of Ramesses III. This is not even halfway along the historical timeline of Thebes. Nor does the story end in 385 AD when the temples like Medina Habu were closed, the pagan temples, by order of the Roman prefect, because as we've seen, the temple of Medina Habu continued on in use as a Christian church beyond that point. And we have people like Kolodje and Frankie, these writers of literate people, who are still there in the period afterwards. The last dated text from the West Bank is from Jami itself, from Medina Habu, and is dated 781. One suggestion that has been made is that these last dated texts are somehow associated with the rebellion of Deir ibn Musa in 785, which was a rebellion by an Umayyad pretender against the Abbasid regime. The point is, at that point, the people are gone, the archaeology stops, the texts stop, and so there seems to be an incident at that moment. And when we think about the archaeology of the Wadi C2 and the project that my colleagues are involved in here, this is, I think, the context we need to be aware of, that there is a moment at the end of the 8th century in which things stop, the activity stops not at the end of the New Kingdom, not in the late period, not even at the end of the Roman Empire, but this moment in the 8th century. Wilkinson in the 19th century records a tradition that the local population was actually removed from the West Bank of Luxor to Esna, and were based at Esna from that point. So there is a tradition, at least, that the population was removed. And we see this in the early depictions of the West Bank, that there's nothing there. This emptiness seems to date from that moment. So the archaeology of the Wadi, I think, needs to be understood in that context. But then we also need to be aware of the fact that, for example, after the earliest European travellers arrive, we get the period of archaeology. And a key moment, for example, I mentioned the Grand Déblaiement by Deresi, which cleared the area of the Temple of Ramesses III. We also get the excavations of people like Flinders Petrie, his famous excavation, 6 temples at Thebes, which begin to expose the New Kingdom mortuary temples. And what they do is create the monumental landscape of the West Bank, which we know today. The monumental landscape that tourists go to visit, the one which is well known to archaeologists and so on. This monumental landscape that we see today is the product of the archaeology at the end of the 19th century. And of course, what it does is create this image of the line of mortuary temples of the new kingdom pharaohs, from Medina Habu at the top to the Ramesseum at the bottom here, the northern end. And beyond that is the desert and the Wadi beyond, and the Valley of the Kings beyond this, and so on. So there is this zone of these royal mortuary temples, and then the vast bleakness beyond that, as it were. We can draw a line of these mortuary temples, of course, and it's interesting to note, I find it interesting anyway, to note that the modern road even follows the line of the Egyptian mortuary temples. So we've created a modern sort of topography for the West Bank, which is based upon the archaeology of the New Kingdom temples. You see the road has to divert around Medina Habu, it's so big, but otherwise it's following this line. And so the Wadi is right up beyond this zone. And at the bottom I've also highlighted the village of Deir al-Medina, the famous village of the workmen. And the reason I point this out is that this is actually another site which is considered to have survived because it was so far out in the desert. And the villagers left at the end of the New Kingdom, and because this site is so far out in the desert, it was left undisturbed. But again, this doesn't actually correspond to the facts. So it's just this image I think I want to look at. So this is just an illustration I copied from a sort of standard modern edition. This is Wilkinson's book on the complete temples of Thebes, and you can see that the monumental landscape is a line of New Kingdom Egyptian mortuary temples. Deir al-Bahri beyond, I've highlighted there in the middle, the Wadi, out in the desert and so on. And this also factors into the idea that what we have is a festival geography in Thebes, which is defined by 2 festival procession routes. The Opet festival from Karnak to Luxor on the east bank, and then the so-called Valley festival, which leads from Karnak across the river to Deir al-Bahri, and then connects together all of the mortuary temples as part of this festival procession. But of course, this monumental landscape is a fiction. This is something which has been exposed by the archaeologists. One of the ways we can check this, of course, is that on the left there is the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. On the right, at the other end of the arrow, is the mortuary temple of Merem-Ptah, which was largely built using material from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. The most famous example of this being the famous Israel stela of Merem-Ptah, which is on the back of a stela of Amenhotep III. But even the mud bricks from the curtain wall of Amenhotep III's temple we used to build the surrounding wall of the temple of Merem-Ptah. So there never was a moment when there was this line of mortuary temples all the way along. They were being, as ironically Hosha mentioned right at the beginning there, they were being dismantled to build the next one or the next but one temple and so on. So we have this modern line of archaeological temples and have somehow created the idea that this corresponds to a moment in the past which never really existed. And as I say, a part of this idea is the village of Deir al-Medina itself being so far out in the desert that it survived miraculously. But this is belied by the fact that we get at Deir al-Medina the temple of Hathor, which is a Ptolemaic temple from the period of the triple monarchy of Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII. And right next to it, you can see the shrines of the New Kingdom chapels of the workmen at Deir al-Medina. But when this temple was built, of course, the village had been abandoned for 1,000 years, and these shrines were covered by rocks, presumably. But perhaps what it does do is show us the fact that Deir al-Medina is where it is because there is a site here. There is a site of worship here, which is important at different periods. And not only do we find the Ptolemaic temple here, but the Ptolemaic temple was then converted into a Christian church as well, the Church of St. Isidore the Martyr, and again continued in use after the pagan temples were closed down. So here at Deir al-Medina, actually, again, one of the things we see is a continuity of use, not occupation in the same way, but we do find monasteries in this area, Christian monasteries and so on. But what we have are the sites of these temples, chapels and so on. Anyway, if we put that all together, the red block there, sorry, I've lost my animation, so I can't unfold this for you bit by bit, but the red block there indicates the time period in which the New Kingdom mortuary temples were being built and used. And you can see it's actually a very small sliver of time in comparison to the overall timeline of use on the West Bank. And after the death of Ramesses III and the closure of the temples, we've got far in the future still events like the Assyrian invasion of Thebes in the 660s, the Roman occupation of the country in 30 BC, and as I say, the closure of the temples and so on, and these sites continue in use. So we mustn't be seduced by the New Kingdom monumental landscape as though it really defines what we are looking at here. So I want to point out the key sites, as it seems to me, in terms of the use on the West Bank. And the first of these is, of course, Deir al-Bahri. Now, when Dr. Lathy was talking before, he mentioned the reign of Thutmose III. And when we think about the New Kingdom mortuary temples, I think the reign of Thutmose III is the key moment for us to understand. The layout of the New Kingdom temples, it seems to me, as we have them, begins in the reign of King Thutmose III, in which, of course, I also include the reign of Hatshepsut, which is completely enclosed by his reign. If we look at his famous poetical stela from Karnak, at the top what we have is an image, in the middle the god Amun-Ra, the king coming in to make offerings to him, and behind him, as he comes into the shrine of Karnak, behind him is the personification of the Theban hills, Keftet Nebes, what is in front of the site of its lord. As I said, the personification of the Theban hills. So what we've got here is the layout of the sanctuary of Karnak with Deir al-Bahri beyond. Osman before showed you the view from the Wadi straight across to Karnak temple. Deir al-Bahri is directly across the way. So when we look at the layout of Karnak temple at the end of the reign of Thutmose III, the famous double axis has developed. The axis closest to us here, which is going south to Luxor for the Opet festival, and then the main axis from the shrine, which looks across the river to Deir al-Bahri, and the famous slopes to receive the image of the god in procession, and so on. Deir al-Bahri, of course, takes us back to the Middle Kingdom, and this is also where we find the tomb of King Mojohotep II as well. So we see the importance of Deir al-Bahri right the way back to the beginning, if you like, of the historical record of Thebes. In fact, it is possible, I wouldn't like to push it, but it's possible that Deir el-Bahri is mentioned in the inscription of Ankh-Tifi, which is the earliest written description we have of Thebes. But the other site, which is certainly mentioned in the inscription of Ankh-Tifi, which is important to Montuhotep II, is the one place where we have a temple of Montuhotep II. So right from the beginning of the historical period, if you like, of understanding the monumental landscape at Thebes, is Medina Habu. And not the great temple of Ramesses III at the back there, which is actually a later addition, but the temple at the front here, which goes back to the 12th dynasty, and is positioned around a site which is described as the mound of Chalmu, Jamie, which is the name of the Coptic village, which was right next door to this. More than 2,000 years later, we've got this continuous record of this place being referred to as Jamie or Chalmu, the mound of the west, the Yat and Imentet, or the Yat and Chalmu, the 18th dynasty temple at the entrance to the great temple of Ramesses III, which is also on top of the 12th dynasty temple, which is described as the mound of Chalmu. So this is actually the key site. The temple of Ramesses III is built next to it because this site is so important. And these are our key sites already in the reign of Thutmose III. If we look at where Thutmose III's temples are built, of course we have Karnak and its connection with the Opet festival. Across the river, though, we have Deir el-Bahri with the famous temple of Hatshepsut, which is the reign of Thutmose III, with the temple of Thutmose III himself, with the mortuary temple of Thutmose III, which is right next to the processional route to Deir el-Bahri. And then there is also the festival of the sacred of place, the Jeza Set, which is the festival to Medina Habu, which in the New Kingdom anyway comes every 10 days from Luxor. So rather than having this line of mortuary temples which run parallel to the cliffs and create this sort of line separating the known area from the desert beyond, actually this is the key topography. And it seems to me this is also the key landscape right the way through the rest of the history of the West Bank. In Christian times, the monastery of Theban, the most important Christian site, is at Deir el-Bahri. Deir, of course, is a monastery. At Medina Habu, we have this rich, important settlement site and the church inside. In fact, there are two churches in Medina Habu, I should have said. So these are places where not only we see Thutmose III establishing a kind of pattern to what he's doing, these are also the places which continue to be important throughout the whole of the rest of the settlement period of Luxor to the 8th century AAD, rather than, as I say, just thinking in New Kingdom terms. So this ongoing occupation is important. As I say, this is the real timeline we should be thinking about. The historical record begins with the inscription of Ankh-Tifi just before 2000 and ends with the last dated text from Jamie, which is dated 781 AD. This is the monastery of Theban at Deir el-Bahri, which I mentioned to you. If we think of Medina Habu, it's not just about how it finishes with a Coptic church, but we can think about other key moments in what we understand about Luxor in the period between the New Kingdom and later periods. So, for example, the random, hard-to-explain burial of King Harsiesi from the third intermediate period, sometime in the late 9th, early 8th century, I guess. The burial of Harsiesi is at Medina Habu, not in the temple of Ramesses III, but in the 18th dynasty precinct, the mound of Jamie that I was talking about before. And of course, if we draw a line, as it were, we box off the 18th dynasty temple, the small temple as it's usually described, you can see actually that Ramesses III is in the background. We've got the tombs of the gods' wives of Amun from the 25th and 26th dynasty, as I said, the grave of Harsiesi, Ptolemaic pylons, Ptolemaic additions. So we've got this kind of continuity of religious sacred activity here in this spot. And as I say, this is the context perhaps in which we should understand the appearance of the Christian churches at the end of this ongoing use as a sacred spot. And just across the way, for example, we have the temple of the Qasr al-Aguz, which is the temple of Thoth Horus, which is a Ptolemaic temple, just Medina Habu. Why is it there? Why is it just stood there outside the temple of Medina Habu? If you're taken as a tourist, you don't get taken to these places normally. They're Ptolemaic. Who cares about these things? But they don't fit in with this picture of the New Kingdom, this line of New Kingdom mortuary temples. And again, as I mentioned to you before, there is the Ptolemaic temple of Hathor at Deir al-Medina. But long after Deir al-Medina exists as a settlement site, the temple of Hathor, which later becomes the church of Saint Isidore, which is alongside the New Kingdom shrines here, which presumably were much reduced if they were visible at all when this temple was built. So, what's the point of that? Well, the point really I'm making is if we look at this chart here, the arrow on the left is pointing to Deir al-Medina, this site which is meant to be out in the desert. At the top, the arrows point to the Wadi C2. And also the area along the cliffs where the graffiti are that Jose Ramon was referring to. They're not just in the Wadi itself, but further along as well. And it seems to me, if we factor that in, so for example with the chapels at Deir al-Medina, including the Ptolemaic chapel and so on, with the things that Jose Ramon talked about before, we get maybe some kind of a priori reason for understanding there is in fact a significant area of activity, possibly religious activity, presumably in terms of its connection with the shrines, which is not just a New Kingdom phenomenon, but which is something we continue to see after the New Kingdom in the area of that curved arrow, which is taking you from the Wadi past Deir al-Medina to the area of Medina Habu. Which of course brings in the issue of the graffiti, which Jose Ramon was mentioning before. And the issue about the graffiti, as he mentioned, is the idea of people coming to these cliffs far out in the desert, or perhaps connected with things that can be seen more locally. Again, as I say, if we think about the New Kingdom line of this fake, as it were, this archaeologically invented landscape, the Wadi and the hills are far away from the festival processions of Deir al-Medina, for example. You see, there will be far removed from these festival processions. But if we actually look at the graffiti, there is this idea of coming to the mountains to see things. This is I won't bother you with this again, this is the prayer of Tutankhamun, which Jose Ramon showed you before, and Jose Ramon was talking about the idea of being here to see the Twin Hills, with his thoughts on what this may be, which would strike me as very sensible thoughts. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that they talk about coming together at this place for other reasons, but the idea of a religious involvement is always there. So we get a graffito like this: "Oh, lords of Thebes, we come as one. We come as one. We come together. Oh, those who satisfy the hidden one," which is a reference to Ammon, "may you say to him, give life and health to the priest of Ammon," and then it lists names and so on. So here we have people up in these cliffs, making reference perhaps to Karnak across the water, of course, but in what connection? In what connection are they here in these hills? Is it really that everything is far distant, or are there things which are happening much closer to them? We also get these enigmatic kinds of references. The Set Sedjer, which literally means a place of sleeping, up in the hills. And in fact, Spiegelberg actually suggests that this is a place where the workmen in the Valley of the Kings came for the siesta. He actually uses the word siesta. This is clearly nonsensical. But Sedjer means spend the night, so maybe actually what we're looking at is a place of vigil, perhaps, spending the night in that sense. And you can see some of them are identified by individuals, the sleeping place for the deputy high and his son Amentu. But we also get this reference, the sleeping place for the men of the crew, the Remech Iset, which we take to be the gang working in the Valley of the Kings, one of the gangs working in the royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. So we can, of course, locate these in the late New Kingdom. It's also worth noting, though, that we find up there other things, including, for example, Coptic graffiti. Now, these only seem to, as far as I can see, and I wish I'd had more chance to look into these things, but these only seem to have been recorded where they happen to occur incidentally next to New Kingdom inscriptions. But they're still revealing, so we get examples like this. For the son of Anastasius, the magistrate of the castle of Jamie, Bacastron and Jamie, which is the town in Medina Habu that I was talking to you about before. So here we have people on the West Bank in Christian times who are still up in those hills for whatever reason, at the same time that the churches at Medina Habu, at Deir al-Medina, at Deir al-Bahri, and in other places on the West Bank, the Ramesseum, for example, at the time that these Christian churches are in use. So again, it seems to me, evidence for ongoing activity in that part of the West Bank, which is usually described as a desert. Here's another example, Parmute, the least, and the whole thing is broken, but it says, for my brother, and then a reference to something of Jamie, which is probably Bacastron and Jamie Castle, which is Medina Habu, the temple of Ramesses III at Medina Habu. So again, as I say, perhaps just further indication that what we're looking at is actually evidence for festivals, perhaps, religious activity of some kind, connected with the shrines at Deir al-Bahri, at Deir al-Medina, and the places beyond. But this activity much closer to the cliffs, much closer to the graffiti, and right, therefore, in front of the Wadi that Sir Ramon was talking to us about before. As I say, these are not well thought out ideas. These are just some thoughts which occurred to me when my friend asked me to come and talk to you about 3 weeks' notice. These are the ideas which came into my head. So again, when we think about the archaeology of the Wadi C2, it seems to me that the context in which we need to be thinking about this is the context that perhaps the monumental landscape of the West Bank has been misunderstood. First of all, the timeline, as we all know, is much greater, but there is too much emphasis perhaps on the New Kingdom aspect of that. And what we haven't done is thought in ways in which, say, the Ptolemaic or the Christian sites are connected together, bearing in mind that these Ptolemaic and Christian religious sites are on the sites of the New Kingdom, the important New Kingdom sites that we can take back to the reign of Thutmose III, and in fact to the reign of Montuhotep II in the Middle Kingdom. And then also connected to the fact that the area was stopped, that whatever their activity was cut off at the end of the 8th century. And people were removed, and that's why when Pocock arrives at the beginning of the 18th century, 1,000 years later, there is nothing to see except the remains, including the remains of Bacastron and Jamie, the castle of Jamie. And of course, this word Castron presumably is connected with the idea of Al-Uqsor, the castles, which is the modern name of this area. There is nothing to see here except Bacastron and Jamie and the Ramesseum. So, thank you for indulging my thoughts on this matter.